Let's begin. My name is Larry St. Clair, and I work at the Bean Life Science Museum. We'd like to welcome you to the College of Life Sciences seminar. They assign that out to different departments in the college throughout the year, and it just so happens that the Bean Life Science Museum was assigned this seminar. We're delighted to have you here. We have a wonderful speaker that I think you'll very much enjoy. I had the privilege of listening to her in New Orleans a couple of years ago and was very much impressed with her message and with her delivery. So we're grateful to have her here. I've asked Dr. Riley Nelson to introduce our speaker.
Nalini Nadkarni does what more scientists should be doing, and that's talking to everybody and including people. Instead of talking amongst ourselves, she's figured out ways to approach issues that she holds to be very important, that of conservation as well as caring for people. And so I've looked up to her work for many years, and we kind of cross paths in odd ways as scientists, that we often play roles of itinerant biologists during part of our career as you're trying to get through grad school. I first met Nalini, and I didn't mention this to her, in the graduate student ghettos of Santa Barbara. There are two kinds of people that live in Santa Barbara: the other people and then the ghetto people. And we had pizza with Tom Dudley and talked about ants with your husband Jack. And then I got, after I left my position at in California, I went to Texas for 10 years, and in Texas I discovered that Nalini and her husband Jack had seen the first cougars in Austin, Texas. Not only seen but heard in a somewhat frightening experience. Cougars in the middle of downtown Austin, Texas, which is a big place. And so I have here, these are enchanted rocks. Not only are these enchanted rocks, but they're from enchanted rock. This is granite from the Llano Uplift in Texas, and I have this as a small gift for Nalini. In addition to that, one day I was having troubles getting water to go down my irrigation pipes up at our ranch, and a tree had fallen over the irrigation lines and broken them. And those of you that are from Maryland or some such place where trees mean a different thing than what trees mean for us in Utah, this is the tree in its whole size. It stood about this tall. This is Gamble's oak, and I got that oak piece out of the way so that the water would flow properly again. And then as I was cleaning up and getting ready to go home, I thought, well, what should I do with this? The typical thing you do with a piece of wood about this size and 6 feet long is burn it, okay? But I took it and did sections of it so I could see what this tree had experienced in part. And this tree makes a canopy that tops about 15 feet tall. Maybe a few a little taller, but this one was only 10 feet tall. And this is every bit a tree. And I counted the rings. This tree is 100 years old. And you can carry a 100-year-old tree around in your pocket. There's something humbling about that to me. And one of the decisions I had to make about in my life was moving back to Utah from living in various other wonderful places, and this is home to me. And one of the things I like most about Utah is that over most of Utah, I tower over the canopy. I don't need to use ropes and ascenders, but I'll do that if I need to as well. So I'd like to present this piece of tree to Nalini in reference to her work in canopies around the world. You're in for a treat. She does what's called the popularization of science, or the making the public aware. Please be more aware after you leave this hall today. Let's hear it for Nalini.
Thank you, Riley. Actually, one of my favorite poems about trees is by Gary Snyder. Probably many of you know Gary Snyder as a nature poet. And one of the pieces of the poems that he wrote were, "To the rocks, trees are just passing through," which I think really speaks not only for the age of the trees, but also for the appreciation we get of time when we think about rocks and other parts of nature. I think what you said really lends itself to an introduction of what I'd like to talk about, which is about the tapestry of science, how we can engage people outside of science to better understand science, and how scientists can engage themselves with different groups in the public to understand and share what they know about the world. And you know, on this cold Utah day, where everybody's bundled up in their coats and scarves, I think it's sort of a wonderful opportunity for us. I hope for you this hour that I can share with you some ideas and some biota, some interactions that I've had the privilege of encountering for the last 30 years of my research, which is the tapestry of the tropical rainforest. I work in Costa Rica, in a place called Monteverde, and over the years I've come to understand the remarkable diversity and interactions of the plants and animals that live in the rainforest canopy, which over the years I've come to understand is really like a tapestry, that these threads of the diversity of plants, of animals, of mushrooms, of soil, of the environment, of rain, of mist, of particulate deposition, all of these form a very complex tapestry, and it is the work of the scientist and also the public, I believe, to try to understand the threads that are on a loom of sorts, the loom of academia to start out with, that weave together to produce this amazing tapestry. And I'm really happy to be here today at BYU. This is my first visit to your university, and I know that you also understand sort of the complexity, the diversity, and the importance of the biota, whether it's in the tropical rainforest or here in the hills of the Wasatch, that you have faculty and students who are doing research, who are doing education, and I just had the wonderful time today of Dr. Sinclair to understand how the museum, the ML Museum of Natural History, is helping to help people understand that it's important to protect their planet. So in terms of the threads I would like to discuss today, I'd like to talk first a little bit to give you an introduction about what I have come to understand through the use of science and biology about the science of the canopy. Secondly, I'd like to share with you the thread of engagement of the canopy and the forest ecosystems with the public. And finally, I'd like to think about some of the ideas we might have as emerging areas for actions, ideas for actions. But before I do that, I'd like to first share with you a little bit about my background. I really know like 3 people in the audience here. So I want to just introduce myself as a preface. Actually, these are my parents, and I always think it's a good idea when you want to get to know somebody to know who their parents were. So this is my mom and my dad. My dad was from India. He's a scientist. He died about 15 years ago, but he was a pharmacologist who studied cancer research. He was a Hindu. He came from India when he was about 25, and he met my mom in graduate school. My mom was from Brooklyn, New York. She was an Orthodox Jew. She was a communications person. She loved languages and communication. And so you might understand then, in terms of my own background, from birth really, my siblings and I were always exposed to this idea of combining cultures together, combining languages together, combining ways of approaching and understanding the world. As a kid, in our sort of chaotic household of 5 kids and dogs and cats and homework and chores and so forth, I found that for me, my refuge was in the trees. We had these 8 maple trees that lined the driveway of my parents' home, and every day I'd come home from school and grab an apple, grab a book, and go up one of these trees. And so it was there that I first really became aware of the strength of trees, their sense of protectiveness, my sense of safety that I felt when I was up in a tree, away in my own world, a world that was really mine. And that sense of trees, that sense of my love of trees, my respect for trees, and my desire to somehow pay them back for what they had given me as a child, led me as a graduate student to try to understand the forest canopy. The forest canopy is defined by scientists as that part of the forest high above the forest floor. There's no real number of meters above the forest floor that defines it. As Riley said, a canopy can be just 10 feet high, or it can be 300 feet high in a tropical rainforest. It was a world that, as a graduate student, was very much unknown. It was called the last biotic frontier. It's a place where people really hadn't known how to climb trees. in terms of getting up to the tops of tropical rainforests. It's a world that is very mysterious in some ways, with deep canyons and high peaks. When you start looking at a canopy from above, as in this old-growth Douglas fir forest in the Pacific Northwest. And over the last 30 years, people have developed a number of really wonderful ways of getting up into the canopy that is safe and is non-destructive to the trees. We use mountain climbing techniques, we use catwalks and walkways, we use hot air balloons, and we use construction cranes to try to get ourselves up into the forest canopy in order to understand and document the biota and the interactions that we see. And because, unfortunately, I can't take you all outside to start climbing tropical trees, I thought I would do the second best thing, which is to show you just a little bit of a videotape of what I and my students and my colleagues experience when we climb into the canopy of a giant strangler fig. How many people would like to be a canopy ecologist? Put up your hand. Yes. So that's how we get up there. And basically, when we get up there, we can tie ourselves in, we can look around, we can collect organisms, we can make measurements, we can do experiments. All of these things are possible to do in this three-dimensional volume of the forest canopy. When you get up into the forest canopy, if you were to join me on that climb into that strangler fig, this is what you would see. It's really a very different microenvironment than what you encounter on the sort of dark, damp forest floor. Because there's no overhanging branches, or very few, there's a much greater amount of sunlight. It's much hotter up there. There are greater extremes of temperature and of relative humidity. There's a lot more wind up there. And so there have been, sort of over evolutionary time, there have been literally thousands of species that have evolved to live their entire life cycles, or part of their life cycles, high up above the forest floor. So three-toed sloths, hummingbirds, these amazing plants, the bromeliads, for example, what we call epiphytes. Epi means upon and phyte means plant. So these are plants that grow perched on other trees. They don't get their nutrients from the trees. Their root systems don't go into the trees, but they get support and exposure to sunlight high in the forest canopy. And of course, there are also some snakes in the forest canopy, but these tend to be very docile and sort of shy, and they're not really a problem. One of the things that I wanted to do as a scientist who was exploring the forest canopy was to understand the importance, or the ecological function, the ecological roles of the plants and animals that live high above the forest floor. And the approach that I was trained in, is ecosystem ecology, trying to understand all of the ecological roles of all the different pieces and parts, that is, that tapestry of the rainforest canopy that I was talking about. So we study the nutrient inputs that come in the form of rain and mist and fog. We try to look at the nutrients that are stored in those canopy-dwelling plants. We look at nutrient transfers when those plants fall down to the forest floor. How long does it take to die? How do they decompose? And finally, the subsequent nutrient uptake, that the roots of the trees and other plants can actually take up the nutrients that were originally intercepted by those canopy plants living in the treetops. One of the major sort of discoveries, I guess, that I and my students carried out was that these canopy plants are incredibly important in terms of nutrient cycling. They actually intercept and hang on to 65% of the nitrogen that comes in the form of rainfall and mist. So they're actually very important in terms of harvesting nutrients, things that plants and animals need in the forest, holding on to them and then transferring those nutrients to the forest floor where they can be taken up by other plants and animals. And as it turns out, the mosses that live in the forest canopy are very important in this interceptive role. These mosses and other canopy plants are also very important in terms of providing food and nutrients and habitat for other animals. So for example, here's an emerald toucanet eating some fruits from one of these epiphytic plants. We see the little hummingbird has gathered mosses to put around its own nest so that it'll camouflage itself from predators. The marbled murrelet over here on this side is actually an endangered species in the Pacific Northwest. And until about 7 years ago, we didn't even know where its nests were. We didn't know how it raised its young. Well, it turns out that after long observations and radio tracking, we know that these marbled murrelets actually use the bolsters of mosses that grow on old-growth Pacific Northwest Douglas fir trees. And so there's just like this little indentation of these mosses, and that is the nest of this endangered species. So as it turns out, even though people who walk through the forest don't really see or encounter these epiphytic plants very often, they actually turned out to have a very disproportionately large role in terms of nutrient interception and providing resources for plants, for other animals. Well, any ecologist who wants to understand the tapestry of life needs to know what happens when you disturb parts of those tapestry. If you remove some of the threads of the tapestry, what happens to the integrity of that whole rug? Well, I got interested in this idea of what happens if you disturb these epiphytic plants, and we did some experiments. We actually removed bunches of these epiphytes, these mosses and other plants, and then we watched over time what happened to them. How long would it take for this bare patch to be recolonized? And because these trees in this tropical rainforest are just covered with mosses, covered with plants, we figured that they would just grow back really quickly. Well, we set up the experiments on lots of these branches that we had stripped of their plants, and we watched, and every year we came back and we took pictures of them, and we came back after 1 year, nothing growing. Second year, nothing. Fourth year, 10th year, 15th year, still nothing growing back. It was only after 22 years that we began to see the first little bits of moss colonizing on the bottoms of the branches, and 10 years later, that is almost 30 years after we stripped these things, have we seen that these mosses and the other epiphytic plants are growing back. So it took an extraordinarily long time for these plants to grow back. They're not resilient. They're actually very fragile, despite the fact that they look very lush and very strong. And so I like to show this picture because to me this means, once it's gone, it is gone. And you can't really expect it to come back in any length of time. So this is sort of funny in a way, but I want you to keep it in mind when we think about actually restoration and replenishing the moss and the other epiphytes in rainforests. Well, it doesn't take very long working as a tropical biologist in tropical countries to understand that, in fact, our tropical rainforests are in grave trouble, that we really do need to protect our planet. There's a tremendous amount of making holes in the tapestry of the tropical rainforest canopy and of rainforest ecosystems. Deforestation is happening at an increasingly rapid rate. We know that global climate change, the predictions for tropical cloud forests, such as this one in Monteverde, are going to be longer and longer dry seasons with less and less input of mist and rain and the nutrients that are in that rain. We know that there are activities like mining that are really harming the soils. There's conversion of tropical rainforests to agricultural lands that are destroying or fragmenting the canopy. The raising of cattle, for example, is permanently changing those tapestried rainforest canopies, the intact canopies, into ones that are torn up or fragmented. Perhaps even more disturbing as I began thinking more and getting more and more aware myself of these kinds of activities is the increasing isolation that human beings all over the world are feeling from nature, from trees, and from forests. It was just last year that for the first time in terms of the human population, more than half of human beings are now living in urban areas rather than rural or suburban areas. So in our daily lives, it's getting harder and rarer and less frequent that we are sort of touching and encountering the pieces of nature that I think we need to sort of keep that connection, to keep those threads woven together. And so now when I think about a little girl growing up in a city like this, rather than like me, who grew up in suburbia and could come and climb trees in her backyard, I began thinking about what are the ways that I, as a scientist, could take some responsibility in terms of protecting our planet. And I knew that I couldn't stop deforestation. I can't always convince legislators to stop the kinds of laws that are encouraging development. But what could I do as a scientist? Well, it seemed that I could try to share some of my knowledge and some of my passion with others, and I really thought that perhaps what I could do is to share it with people who maybe don't understand the importance of forest canopies. It might be something obscure in their experience. And so one thing my students and I did was create Treetop Barbie, because we knew that maybe little girls who love their Barbies, I have a daughter who's now 22, but who begged for a Barbie doll. I thought, well, if we could sort of put this idea that Barbie really treasures and values the ecological values of trees and forests, that might translate to the recreational values that a little girl might have. So we made a prototype Treetop Barbie. We approached Mattel, which is the company that makes Barbies, and we offered this idea to them. And surprisingly, they didn't really want to take on this idea. And so we said, well, we can do this ourselves. So now what we do is we go to Goodwill stores and Deseret Industries. We buy up used Barbies. We have volunteer seamstresses who make the little costumes. We buy the little helmets on eBay. And most importantly, we've made this little booklet called Treetop Barbie, and it's about canopy plants and animals of the Pacific Northwest, which has descriptions of lichens and mosses that grow in trees that Treetop Barbie is extremely interested in. So we feel that that might be one way, one tiny pathway of linking the ecological values, of knitting together the ecological values of forest canopies with the values that a little 6-year-old or 7-year-old girl might have. We're working now on ground support Ken, but somehow that's not the big seller that we hope it would be, so we have to work a little bit harder on that. But anyway, what I'd like to do now is to sort of take that idea, take that concept of saying, I as a scientist have documented the ecological values of the ecological values of nutrient cycling, of habitat restoration and so forth, of trees and forest canopies, but to link them with other aspects, other values in society. And what I'd like to describe in the next little while are the linking ecological values to aesthetic values, linking ecological values to spiritual values, and linking ecological values to social justice values. So let's start with aesthetics values. Actually, you know, when you think about aesthetic values in trees, it's like dead easy to put those two together. For hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, artists and musicians and poets have gone to trees and forests for inspiration. And so this connection of tree values and aesthetic values is really something that's very easy to make that link or to weave together. And I did this in a formal way. I've done this a number of times. I started an activity called Canopy Confluences. And the idea is to bring together a group of people who might be able to teach each other or share with each other the different kinds of values that they have for forest canopies. So I invited for a week to spend a week out in the forest in a remote area of the Pacific Northwest or down in Costa Rica. To spend a week down there, we put platforms into the canopy that we built so people could easily and comfortably sit in the forest canopy. We taught each of those people how to climb into the forest canopy, and we sort of said, okay, let's see what you do. So we had a number of forest ecologists, people who speak the language and share the conceptual approaches that I as a scientist and as a forest ecologist do. But I also invited a number of artists, visual artists, and musicians, and poets, and opera singers, and even Inuits and blind people, people who have never seen a forest canopy, to join us in the forest canopy to perceive and understand and then communicate through their own tools what they come to understand of the forest canopy. And I'll just show you a few of the outcomes. This is a piece of installation art that was created by Bruce Chow after he had joined us on a Canopy Confluence in the Northwest. He thought about it for a while. He's kind of a slow thinker, kind of very ruminative artist. And then he went back to Rhode Island and he made this piece of art, which he called Ether. And he had sat around the campfire with all of the forest ecologists and other people who talked about forest dynamics and how trees fall down and branches fall down and how that's a natural part of the forest ecosystem. So he made this big ball that you see up there that was woven together of branches that he picked up on the ground, and he put this ball up there and he just left it up there. And of course, after 2 or 3 months, pieces of branches started falling off, and people would call up Bruce, hey, Bruce, you know, your installation is falling apart. And he said, yep, I'm not going to fix it. That's what happens in forest ecosystems. Branches fall, trees fall. That's a natural part of the forest ecosystem. So he was able to express that very fundamental piece of forest ecology through the medium of art that, to me, as someone who appreciates art, was really just blown away in terms of his ability to have communicated that complex idea. I worked with a number of modern dancers, a group called Capacitor, to create a dance called Biome. I brought Jody Lomas, the choreographer, on a Canopy Confluence in Costa Rica with all of her dancers. We climbed trees. I told her about strangler figs, about frogs, about vines. And before you knew it, 3 days into it, they all had their clothes off. They were dancing naked in the forest. It was just wonderful. But they went back to San Francisco, and they created this incredible dance called Biome. We got a grant to perform it in San Francisco and in Seattle. And the way we did the performance was really weaving together science and art and action. I started out by giving a little talk, like 10-minute talk about the tropical cloud forest, its diversity, its reliance on the canopy biota for nutrients, its interweaving of these different parts of the ecosystem. And then Jody and her troupe danced this amazing dance that was many levels and had a video behind it, and it was just an incredibly inspiring and beautiful piece of art. And then in the lobby, after the performance was over, we had conservation groups who had tables with opportunities to do volunteer work, so that the audience then was instructed of the education that they got from my scientific talk. They were inspired by this aesthetic piece of dance, and then they were moved to action that they could take as they walked through the lobby and out into the rest of their world. So we feel that this is a really great model that not only I and a dancer can put together, but that other scientists and other artists might put together in order to incite and provide and implement actions for conservation. We also had musicians in the canopy during these Canopy Confluences, a wooden flute player, an oboist, a wooden guitar player, and a rap singer. This was this guy right here, his name is Duke Brady. He was 21 years old from San Francisco, and he was a real hip-hop guy. So we brought him along. He went up into the canopy, and he made these fabulous canopy rap songs that really turned out to be the most popular. I'll just play a little bit of one of them for you.
Look up, expand your perspective. Don't click cut and don't be so selective. Just another minute and I will leave you alone. Try walking a mile in a different biome.
Which I think is a great rap song. Kids loved it, and I realized since kids loved it that maybe this was an access pathway for me as a scientist to get access and get a connection to weave, again, these ecological values of trees to kids who live in urban areas, at-risk kids who may not have had the opportunity to really think about how important trees are. So I hired a professional rap singer. His name is Caution. We rounded up 40 kids from Tacoma, Washington, which is an urban area not far from where I lived. We brought them to our campus. I, the biologist, and Caution, the rap singer, and these kids went out into the forest and down to our beach. The scientist picked up a squishy, clam or a piece of wood, and then Caution would start rapping on it or making a piece of spoken word poetry on it. And of course, they liked him because he was so cool. And so we also then brought them into our sound studios in the afternoons. And with the help of Caution, he got them into little groups, gave them some beats. And so they then sort of translated their experience that morning in the field or in the forest or on the beach into a rap song or spoken word poetry. By the end of the week, we were able to cut a CD with the kids' songs, which they then took home to their family and their friends. And they were then able to incorporate the values and the culture that they were familiar with, that they valued, with these ecological values that they had encountered on our campus. Fashion, I think, is another kind of application of the aesthetic world. And you can look at me and say, well, like, what does she know about fashion? And I don't know much about fashion, but I do understand that fashion is very important. Clothing, in some ways, are our identity. When we choose to wear a cap, when we choose to wear something sort of semi-nice to honor the occasion of an important lecture like this, we're really expressing something about how we feel about an occasion or how we feel about a person. And so I felt that fashion being so important to most people, if we could link what we can understand as the importance of nature with fashion, we might have another avenue for communication. Now, of course, our society is not without nature clothing. We know about camouflage clothing. The military uses this, certainly hunters use it. But if you buy a shirt from Cabela's and you look at it, you will see that there are maple leaves on oak branches. And it just drives you crazy to see that they're not putting the right things together. And so I said, well, let's start a line of botanically correct clothing that will truly express. And so this was my first attempt. This is a moss cape. I sewed the mosses on this cape that I had. It grew over the years. It's gotten bigger and bigger, and it also sheds a good deal. So I realized, that's not the kind of cape you can actually wear inside to a party. And so my approach now is to, I'm now working on a fashion line that actually takes images of plants, canopy plants. We print those images on the fabric itself. We made this attractive little jacket. But the key here, just like the key being this booklet, is that there's a little hang tag that comes along with that jacket that has information about this canopy plant. This is Piper aretum, grows in the canopy. It's sort of endangered, and that habitat is endangered. It's related to the black pepper that you put on your scrambled eggs. So that's the information we have on the hang tag. So that you, Patty, if you were to wear this jacket and go into Starbucks or Krispy Kreme donuts or wherever you get your morning fix, and someone's in line and goes, Patty, that's a beautiful jacket, you would be able to say, oh, well, this is Piper aretum. It lives in the canopy of the Monteverde cloud forest. And it's in the same family as the black pepper you put on your scrambled eggs in the morning. And it really needs conservation. And here's a group, the World Wildlife Fund, that's trying to preserve this forest. So then, in the same way as Barbie, we have a vehicle into the world, fashion, something you don't normally associate with education or conservation, but one which I think can be really effective in terms of making people aware of the importance of the beauty and the ecological importance of these plants. Okay, so we talked about aesthetic values. Let's move to spiritual values, and I'm really happy to be at BYU, which is, I can just feel the spirituality here of LDS that I'm eager to learn more about. And I was really pleased to see on your own website that as LDS scientists and students, we embrace the concepts that the earth and its resources need to be carefully managed as part of our stewardship. So I know that all of you understand as part of your faith, if not your science, that this is a really important piece, that we can link the ecology, the integrity of the tapestry of nature to what we believe spiritually. And as I'm sure all of you know the Book of Mormon, and I'm sort of learning about that as I get acquainted with Utah here, has a wonderful passage, the Dream of Lehi, where there was this tree with white fruits, with a rod going toward it, this idea of the faithful moving towards the symbol of life, the symbol of faith. So that's very deeply embedded in the scriptures of your own faith. I became very interested in the idea of looking at the scriptures of the world's great religions in order to understand the relationship between ecology and conservation with the world religions. And so my approach to this was to actually read the books, the holy books, and understand how they are discussed in the holy scriptures of different world faiths. So starting with the Old Testament, of course, the very first book of Genesis, we learn about two very important trees, right? The tree of life and the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Thank you. Being a Hindu Jew, I don't really know the scriptures as the Christian scriptures as well as I should. But that's very, very valuable trees that we see here in the central part of the Garden of Eden, where it all started. We see many other references to trees in the Bible, the olive branch that was brought back as a symbol of hope that was given to Noah as the dove came back with that olive branch. And so what I did was I started reading, and I downloaded the Old Testament from the web, and I did a search for the words tree and forest in the Old Testament, and I found that there were 328 references to those two words, trees and forests. And being a scientist, of course, I had to classify those verses into the different kinds of tree use, synthetic and symbolic and aesthetic use, analogies to life and God, the practical use of trees like eating fruit, location descriptions, tree loss is bad, and even there are some references to tree biology. I went to other religions, like in Hinduism. We know the sacred forests of India very often preserve the few remaining little tiny spots of primary forests because Hindus believe that the spirits of gods live in those sacred groves. And so they confer a sense of spirituality, but also a sense of protection and conservation. In the Jewish faith, we know about the wonderful holiday of Tu B'Shavat, which is the new year for the trees, in which there's a Seder or a special celebratory meal that celebrates the nuts and the fruits and the shade that trees offer to Jews and other people. And it's a time for tree planting, a time to offer money to plant trees in the desert of Israel. Many of the Native American religious and spiritual traditions involve the forest, carving masks that represent the creatures that live in forests. These masks are made of wood, reinforcing this idea of connection and interweaving of spirituality and the forest. Well, having gathered all of this information from different sources about these deep connections between forests and trees and spirituality, I put together a sermon called Trees and Spirituality, and I began knocking on the doors of places of worship, offering myself as a person who could give a sermon on that topic. It took a little while to sort of get into it, but the Unitarians were actually the first people who kind of opened their doors and allowed me to take the pulpit. But after that, I was sort of passed around to different faiths: Presbyterian, Episcopalian, Catholic, Jewish, Buddhist, Baptist, and I was able then to share these ideas that spirituality and ecology of forests and trees are really very closely tied. One of the latest things I've been doing has been to map trees and churchyards and to make little booklets about the trees that reside on the holy grounds of spiritual structures like churches and synagogues, with descriptions about each of the trees, describing the species of that trees, but also if there's some religious reference to that tree species, we include that in these booklets as well. And so people then, the congregants of that church or that synagogue, then understand that they're protecting not only their holy scriptures or their sacred places in which to speak, but also that around them, in their own churchyards, are places to be mindful of the sacredness of, and to be stewards for the sacredness of the living things that live in their churchyards. One of the projects that I'm working on now is to create booklets, natural history booklets, for missionaries who might be going to different parts of the world. And perhaps all of you can give me, many of you I'm sure have gone on missions or are thinking of going on missions, whether this might be a useful booklet to have. That is the 10 most common trees, the 10 most common birds, the 10 most common flowers of Tahiti or Costa Rica or wherever you are, to make an initial connection with the people with whom you'll be having conversations perhaps about your faith. So I've been trying to work with the LDS Church to see whether this might be something that would really help the idea of the mission of connecting with people in other places in order to sort of have a better mission experience. So the last thing I'll talk about in terms of the values that forests and trees have concerns social justice. But actually this connection to social justice came not from some sort of an outreach or activist kind of thing. It came out of an environmental issue, an environmental problem. And that is an environmental problem that occurs in the Pacific Northwest, where I used to live. There's a whole practice of removing mosses from tree trunks and branches for the horticulture trade. Basically, people go out into the forest, they grab mosses off of trunks, they put them in trucks, they take them to middlemen who then sell them to horticulturists. And this doesn't sound like a bad idea. It's like, oh, people can make their living off of the forest without cutting the trees down. That sounds good. But what did we learn? Hopefully, what did you learn just a few minutes ago? How long does it take these mosses to grow back? 20 to 30 years. So this is not a sustainable practice. And these mosses are important to the ecosystem. They protect little birds. They capture nitrogen from the atmosphere. And so again, I had to ask myself as a scientist, what can I do about this environmental issue? I can't go out there and stop people poaching, in the back roads of the national forests and national parks of the Pacific Northwest. There's just not enough of me. But maybe what I could do is to learn how to grow mosses, how to farm mosses, so that there won't be so much pressure, wild collecting pressure, on these old-growth forests of the Northwest. And it also seemed to me that perhaps prisoners would be great partners for this. Prisoners often have a lot of time. They're denied access to nature just by virtue of their being in prison, so they have really almost no contact with nature at all. So they might be people who would be the most eager to help me learn how to horticulturally learn how to raise mosses. And so I thought this would be a good project. I started knocking on the doors of a number of state prisons in my area in Washington State. I got a lot of who are you and what are you doing here at our prison? But after a while, I found a prison called the Cedar Creek Correction Center. It was a 400-bed men's minimum security prison. And the superintendent was quite forward-thinking, and he said, well, it can't hurt, why not? Bring in your mosses. And so we did. My students and I brought in our mosses. We taught the men how to tell the difference between the different species of mosses. They helped build these racks out of recycled lumber. We did some in hanging bags, some in flats. And after 18 months, it was amazing. They took great care of these mosses, and I, as a scientist, got my answer as to which species of mosses grow fastest. The inmates loved it. because they got to interact with my graduate students. They were doing something that was helpful. They were taking an opportunity to contribute that they didn't have before. They were learning great job skills in terms of social interactions. And the superintendent loved it because he found that the men were having better social interactions. There were fewer violent infractions. So they said, you got any other projects? So I said, well, let's just start with a science lecture series and see what works out. So I began once a month to bring scientists into the prison to give lectures about their research. Here I am giving a lecture about cedar trees. We also had people working on sustainability projects like gardening and so forth. Before you knew it, this little prison had turned into sort of a green prison. They listened to a lecture about organic gardening, and the superintendent said, we could put that in here. So he had the men rip up the lawn and put in these sustainability gardens. We said, well, we could do beekeeping. So I brought in some graduate students from Washington State University and taught the men how to do beekeeping. So they were creating honey for the prison table. We began recycling in a very small way, but the shed got more and more used, and we began actually saving the prison money because there were fewer trips from the prison to the landfill because there was more and more recycling going on. And then I began working with conservation groups to try to teach the men how to raise endangered species in prison. Not just moss, but the Oregon spotted frog, which is now an endangered species in Washington State, the Taylor checker spot butterfly, an endangered species of butterfly, that they grow now from eggs to caterpillars and now to the beautiful adults that are then released by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service into threatened areas. And also they've been working with the Nature Conservancy to rear up 17 species of rare prairie plants that are again taken out and planted in areas that are endangered, these prairie areas. So what we learned then was that these inmates, although we tend to think of them as the sort of the worst part of society, the people we throw away, actually turned out to be people who can actively improve and enhance the probability of survival of these endangered species whom we recognize as needing help. It's been an enormous effort that has been contributed to by many, many, many different agencies and groups. It's not just one person or one agency. It's definitely a collaborative interweaving, a tapestry of organizations and communities that has made the Sustainability in Prisons project work. We've gotten great media attention from this. It's such an unlikely sort of pairing of, strange bedfellows of prisoners and conservation groups and academics. But we've been written up in a very diverse group of journals, from Science all the way to Playboy magazine, which was really interesting. So people, I think, really understand that there's an attraction and a desire to figure out these connections between these unlikely partners in terms of trying to protect our planet. Although that work, I think, was really important and continues to be important and now has spread to 9 different states and 20 different prisons, this idea of enlisting the help, the citizen science, the citizen conservation of incarcerated men and women for conservation, I understood as I began working more closely with prisoners that I was only getting at the sort of outer rim of prisoners. Those minimum security men and women, or those who were about to be released, or those on good behavior that my students and I could have contact with. And in fact, there's a huge part of the prison population that is really like super incarcerated, those who live in solitary confinement for days to weeks to months and in some case years. And this is because of their violent behavior, that they can't sort of interact with the general population. They're placed in very, very tiny cells, 9 by 12 feet, very plain. They get their meals inside their room, so they don't even have social interaction with other prisoners. And to me, it seemed like this was about as extreme as humans get in terms of deprivation of nature, of being separated from those wonderful benefits that humans get when they do interact with nature. And I knew I couldn't bring frogs to them. I can't bring soil to them. I can't bring plants to them. I can't even bring science lecturers to them. And so I thought that maybe what we could do is to bring nature imagery to them. We could put up still pictures in their exercise rooms where they go for 1 hour a day. And we've started now working in the Snake River Correctional Institution in Eastern Oregon, where we've installed a projector and we have a number of nature films, documentaries, that we're now projecting onto the sides of their exercise rooms. So that at least for an hour a day, we're providing them with the opportunity to be immersed to some extent, not in nature, but in the imagery of nature, which is something more than they have been able to get before. And we're now starting a research project with social scientists and eco-psychologists to understand the impact of this this intervention, this nature intervention, to the most nature-deprived people on our planet. What we've learned, what I've learned anyway, as a scientist who has spent much of her career, you know, in the wonderful hallways of academia, in the remote primary forests of Costa Rica, in the classrooms where I get to share my understanding and gain understanding from my students, I've come to understand that interactions and interweavings with the public is one of the ways I can best understand the world. That it's not always a one-way street of me shoving information about global climate change or carbon cycling or nutrient cycling down the throats of the public, but if I can be a little bit clever and sympathetic and empathetic about what other people value and link what I value with their values, I think we all have a better chance of making those kinds of interactions synergistic. So we've talked a little bit about science of the canopy, about education and engagement projects, and I'd like to just sort of finish up about emerging ideas for actions. And I have presented to you these three areas of the types of values that I've played around with: aesthetic, spiritual, and social justice. But when I think about, you know, if I were to advise you, or if you asked me, how can I help? How can I link science? How can I link conservation with other values? I would say that there's a whole range of values that society has that you might be able to interact with. So there might be culinary connections. The spices that we get from trees might be of interest to people who cook. So I really think that this kind of connections, the kinds of connections that you can make for conservation, depends on the kinds of values that you might gravitate towards in terms of making those links between nature and other parts of society. So to sort of conclude, as I look out on the tapestry of the cloud forest in Costa Rica, and I think about these remarkable interactions of the biota with their environment, I find that I realize it's not a simple thing. And I don't mean it's not a simple thing in terms of, well, how many species are out there, thousands and thousands, thousands and thousands of interactions. I mean that it's not a simple thing in terms of our understanding about what we should do. And very often I think about this image. Do you guys know who this god is? This is a Greek god. Two-headed. Janus. Janus is the god of doorways, of portals, of gateways. And very often Janus is about the god of decision-making. And very often when we see these two faces of Janus, it embodies sometimes the confusion that we feel when we have to make a decision or we have to take an action. And so dealing with conservation, dealing with this interface of science and engagement as I have, and also dealing with young people especially, who I see at times are confused, are bothered, are sometimes depressed about what they see in the world today. These decisions they have to make, you know, do I cheer for the red or the blue? That's kind of a decision you have to make. Do I immerse myself in research or engagement? That's a decision people feel they have to make. And maybe most important, how do I balance the forces of despair that I see about the world right now and the hope that I wish I can feel and see and move forward into the world? And that is that balance of despair and hope that I continue to question, I continue to search for. I don't have the answer myself to tell you about how you should find that balance between despair and hope. But I will tell you this, I think that finding that balance is not up to science alone. It's not up to arts alone. It's up to some sort of sense of connection that I believe that we do feel and to be mindful of. It's about that relationship between human and nature that we will all be exploring for the rest of our lives. But I'd like to leave you with just some images that to me exemplify this very tight connection we have. And with the hope, my hope, that the actions that you take will allow us to continue the hope that those interactions, that tapestry, will remain intact. And this is the image that I'd like to leave you with, the image of the tree, the dendritic structure of a tree. the branch structure. A tree we see everywhere in nature, not just in trees. We see them in rivers. When I fly over the United States and I look down on river systems, I realize, oh, rivers are just flattened out trees that are filled with water. They really have this sort of structure of a tree. We hold trees in our brains. This is an image of the dendrite, the dendron. Dendron, by the way, means tree in Greek. So in our own brains, we have these structures of nerves that are in the shapes of trees. Trees are associated with our lungs. This is a set of human lungs that breathe in and breathe out, which is really what life is all about. Without breathing, we have nothing. And finally, and I have to say, this is one of my very favorite images in the world, I think. This is the human heart. And I don't know about you, but when I look at this image, I see that, in fact, we do have trees in our hearts. So with that, I want to thank you again for listening to the ideas that I have, the actions I've tried to take to link the amazing worlds of trees and forests with those of humans and society. Thank you. And I think we have some time, yes, is that right?
We do. We have a couple of minutes for a couple of questions. Any questions you'd like to ask? Oh, here's one right here.
What percent of the biodiversity in these forest systems are found in the canopies?
It's very difficult to say. People, of course, want to know that question because it's important in terms of conservation and just our natural curiosity. There have been a number of wildly different estimates of that, but in general, people have said there can be as much as 50% of the biodiversity based on the measurements of just a few taxa. So we've looked at beetles in the canopy, ants in the canopy, certain orchid groups in the canopy, and when we look at the proportions of those, we realize I don't think that we'll ever know the exact figure, but I think what we can say with some certainty is that there's a tremendous number of species up in the canopy that we simply don't see on the forest floor. And it'll take a long time to try to sort of nail down what that figure is. And that's a fairly recent understanding. I'd say in the last 20 years is when people went like, oh, the canopy isn't just an extension of the forest floor. It's actually a different place with a different topography, a different set of environmental conditions. And it's been there for a long, long time. So plants and animals have had a chance to evolve up there.
Another question? We have one more. Okay, there we go.
So E.O. Wilson put this idea forward about biophilia, that people connect to the landscape because of our deep evolutionary histories with the landscape. I'm curious what you can say about trees and humans, and especially for those people maybe who have never been reared in an environment where they've interacted with the trees. What sort of response do you see from those people that maybe would inform that idea?
Yeah, those are two great questions. I think the first question, which is what can we specifically say about trees and humans and their evolution and our sense of proclivity or closeness to trees, I do believe in what Gordon Oriens calls the savanna hypothesis, that because we evolved as a species collectively in the savannas of Africa, that sort of landscape actually kind of looks right. We feel safe. And in terms of the trees, a number of behavioral psychologists have actually given different kinds of landscapes, different habitats, and even different tree shapes to people and said, which do you prefer? So, and what it turns out is that widely sort of sward, sort of a lawn-like scene with a few widely spaced trees that are lollipop-shaped seem to be the, at least, not universally totally, but at least as far as we can tell, looking at the people who took these tests, tells us that that's really where they feel comfortable. And being in the trees, of course, was a safe place because the predators were all on the forest floor. And we know that being high is something, well, I won't say being high is something humans really value, but being up high is something. When we go to the top of the Space Needle or we pay a lot more money for a penthouse apartment, it feels safe because we have this wonderful scene below us. And so I think that's another sort of human safety thing that comes along. It was interesting when I was asking the prisoners about which habitat they would like to have as still pictures on their exercise rooms. I, being a forest person who loves tropical rainforests, I said, well, we don't even have to ask them. I know what they're going to say. They're going to say this beautiful, fantastic forest. So we printed out different habitats for them, and none of them wanted the closed primary forest. They wanted the desert, They wanted the open steppe, you know, the sagebrush. And I said, how can you possibly pick those? I mean, I tried to not bias them. I said, oh, why did you pick those? And they said, well, because it's so dark in here all the time. We want open. We want to see the sun. We want to be out and open. So I think that there's quite a lot of flexibility. There's a lot of range of what people feel like. I think a lot of it has to do with where we grow up. You know, I grew up on the East Coast, eastern deciduous forest. I feel that feels good when I go home, you know, to visit my mom, because it's what I was raised with. But I think there's some trends, which is this biophilia savanna hypothesis, but I think there are lots and lots of exceptions to that. And just to address your second question, what happens when you bring people into the forest who haven't experienced or lived with it? I did that experiment in a very, very tiny way with this Canopy Confluence. I wanted to know what desert people or tundra people, how they would respond and how they would describe and how they would come to understand what a tree is if they'd never seen it before. And so on one of the Canopy Confluences, I Googled Inuit, and I came up with these two school teachers in Nunavut, in a little tiny village called Arviat, which is high in the north, where it's nothing but tundra. We flew them down. They came in. They had literally never seen a tree before. And we said, okay, how many words for the word snow do you have? And they went on and on, 26, 27, 28, 30. Okay, what's your word for tree? They looked at each other and they said, well, we use the word nabaktuk, which means pole. And what's your word for forest? Nabaktuk juit, which means many poles. And I mean, we laugh about that, that's crazy, but literally that's, they didn't have a word for it. Linguistically, they hadn't evolved a word for that. So we took them with us to the confluence. We were camping out. They chose to camp underneath a western red cedar tree, which, by the way, happens to be the species that are revered most by the native tribes of the Pacific Northwest. They climbed trees with us. They had a hard time with heights because they had never been over a one-story building, but they managed to do it. They hung out with us in the campfires. And at the last day, we said, so Emil and Brian, tell us what you learned. And they said, well, you should treat your trees the way we treat our elders, because they are your... And Brian had made an image, and he made a picture of trees which looked like poles, but in front of one of the trees, he had made this stone cairn, this stack of stones. And we said, what's that stone cairn? And he said, well, we don't have trees or markers in the tundra, but we use these piles of stones as our pathfinders. And he said, after 1 week and living under that cedar tree, I see that trees are your pathfinders. I mean, and that is not an uncommon thing for some of us who have grown up around trees and know how great they are. But for two people who had never seen a tree, who had no experience with trees, who didn't even have a word for tree, to us who were listening around that campfire, that was a very significant conservation statement, I think. And to me, I was happy to hear it because it seemed like that means then there might be something that is deep inside all of us, whether we've been exposed to or not, that feels this connection to what a tree is and fundamentally, at a very elemental level, understands that. And in the case of Brian and Emil, we're able to articulate that.
Thank you, Dr. Nadkarni, and thank you for coming.